Hello, everyone. This is my analysis of chapter 18 of Dorian Gray here. I'll also be touching upon some of the research paper topics that my class is working on right now, too. Okay. So, at the very beginning of chapter 18 of the Picture of Dorian Gray, Dorian is, quote, sick with a wild terror of dying, end quote. That's from page 153 of my copy. And of course, he is still distraught over seeing James Vane through the window in the previous chapter, after which he collapsed and then pretended to everyone else as if he was okay, but we could see that he was not through the narration. And then Dorian here begins to question if he really did see James at all. And this is after the narrator comments that Dorian keeps seeing James every time that he closes his eyes too. So Dorian starts to try to rationalize this by questioning, like, well, is he really even there actually? Suggesting that it was, quote, his imagination that made each crime bear its misshapen brood. Okay, so he's suggesting there, and he continues with this to say that he thinks his conscience is getting to him at this point, that he didn't actually see James there, that James was not really there. He goes on to rationalize that James didn't know who he is. James never learned his name, at least in the chapter of the opium den. It was never identified as such, although possibly he could have learned it through some of the people there, like Adrian Singleton, for example, would know who he was. So James could have found this out. But Dorian tries to rationalize that James couldn't know who he was. There's no way that he could actually be here harassing Dorian like this, actually. So Dorian says it's just his imagination. He rationalizes also that no one else saw James, that makes it impossible as well, because some of the servants at the Duchess's house here would have seen him actually. This also reminds us as readers about the painting. I know I posed the question to my students before, did the painting actually change, or is this all just in Dorian's head? And it certainly left questionable, at least up to when Basil is killed by Dorian. At that point, when Basil sees the change in the painting, and that seems to confirm to us that it was real. But up to that point, we didn't really know, right? It might have just been all in Dorian's head, and that could have been his conscience here too, there too. So this is a reminder of how we could have viewed the painting previously as well there. Okay, and so it is possible even that Dorian has imagined the whole thing. I think that's unlikely, but it's possible at least that he just created a lot of that in his head actually. Okay. So Dorian keeps rationalizing that he didn't actually see James, and he blames his conscience for this. He actually uses the word conscience. But this seems to upset him even more because he realizes that if it's just his conscience, that suggests that he's going to be tormented and haunted by his crimes for the rest of his life, actually. Okay, and if that's the case, then what escape is there for him? This kind of leads to a somewhat pessimistic view of life here. And of course, Dorian expresses a lot of pessimism, particularly after Basil's death. You see that coming through more and more in him. So that's one of the research paper topics that you could be writing about for this too. Okay. So we have the quote here: out of the black cave of time, terrible and swathed in scarlet, rose the image of his sin. And that's a reference back to him murdering Basil here, and how Dorian feels like he can't escape it. He's just imagining that the sin of murder, like being personified here in a way, coming back to him. And other reference to colors there. Wilde likes to reference a lot of colors here to emphasize his points here. Red probably to represent murder, for example. Okay. So Dorian just stays locked up in his room for a few days here, even though he's on vacation basically. But on the third day, he finally emerges. Nature seems to revitalize him. There's been other references to that sort of thing in the book previously. And he feels revitalized. It's a recurring motif. We have the quote: his own nature had revolted against the excess of anguish that had sought to maim and mar the perfection of its calm. So that's a reference back again to his conscience sort of tormenting him, and haunting him. But here he's basically saying that like by getting out into nature, and sort of like freeing himself from like the prison he created for himself in a way, that he is able to kind of just go revolt against that, as he says here, okay, and to get back to like where he wants to be, with this calm and less what's the word I want, less haunted feeling. And so he's convinced at this point, convinced himself at least, that James at the window was just imaginary, that it didn't actually happen at all. Okay, and he even says that he feels pity and contempt for his feelings previously, that his sins were coming back to haunt him and such, and thinking that James was real, which is really just another attempt to further rationalize his feelings here. Okay, and try to just further rationalizing that everything is okay, actually. There's nothing really to be worried about. Okay, but the rest of the chapter shows us that this is not really the case, that Dorian actually is still upset, and still worried, and he should be, as we find out by the end of the chapter here. Okay. So during the hunt, Dorian is, quote, dominated by the carelessness of happiness, by the high indifference of joy. So he feels like he's moved on at this point, and he's back to like the way that things should be. Okay, and when he comes across Sir Joffrey, who is what was he, I think of the brother of the Duchess of Monmouth. They spy a rabbit together. They're out on the hunt, of course. It's expected that they would find this. There's, of course, the gameskeeper mentioned here, for example, making sure that these animals are available and such. But when Dorian sees it, he tells Joffrey not to shoot, which is totally irrational, because the whole point of this is to go hunting animals, actually, and to shoot them. But Joffrey's just like, why are you being silly about that? Joffrey goes ahead and fires. But instead of hitting the hare, he shoots a man, which is a complete surprise. Apparently, there was a man in the bushes there, and Joffrey and Dorian, I think, are both like upset about this. They ask the gameskeeper, like, what's one of your men doing up here in this place, right? But we find out later on that the gameskeeper doesn't even know who this man is. He's a complete stranger here at this point. But Dorian is immediately upset by this, okay? Which is odd, because, like, why should he be upset by this? Dorian says that it's a very bad omen. And he uses that phrase again, a bad omen, just a couple lines later, I think, when he's talking to Lord Henry about this. Okay, but Lord Henry is just completely disconnected from it. He says, quote, "It is nothing to us," end quote, from page 155. And why do they have such contrasting attitudes here? Well, I think this is a sign that Dorian is still kind of haunted by his conscience here. And that could explain why he tells Joffrey not to shoot the hare, but he feels somewhat guilty for taking lives, and maybe in a way here. But Lord Henry doesn't even care about this, because to him it doesn't even affect him. There's no value in brooding upon this for him. Okay, and he kind of continues on this train of thought a little later. Lord Henry also says here that, quote, "The only horrible thing in the world is ennui," end quote, from page 155 in my edition. And here we have a direct reference to ennui, and a reminder to us of how Lord Henry is always trying to avoid this sense of boredom, actually, right? And dwelling upon this man's death doesn't have any value for him, right? Like, to him, that would just probably be boring. There's nothing of interest in it to him, actually, right? And it's a way for him, of course, to try to get Dorian to just move on from this, and to try to keep having fun at this party. That's what they're here for, after all, right? Is to avoid ennui, to avoid like pessimism too, for that matter. That kind of comes up in this chapter in a way here too, with Dorian, having the sense of it being a bad omen that this man was shot. That's obviously a very pessimistic view on things, right? To think like that it means something bad's going to happen. Now, obviously, there's no direct connection between these two things, right? Just because this man in the bushes accidentally ends up getting shot and dies here, doesn't necessarily mean that anything bad is going to happen to Dorian at this point, right? But he has that sense because he has this pessimistic view about life now, right? And this comes through more and more in the chapter as I'm going to get to here soon. Okay. Um, so to go back to Lord Henry here, Lord Henry is rationalizing that there are no omens. He says also that nothing bad can happen to Dorian because, quote, you have everything in the world that a man can want. There is no one who would not be delighted to change places with you, end quote. Okay, which of course is very ironic in a way here because Dorian does not feel like he has everything, or if he does even, it doesn't really matter to him, right? He still has this pessimistic view about life, actually, right? Um, and would everyone be delighted to change places with Dorian? Well, those that don't know him especially well, we would probably say yes. He is very, upper class, of course, doesn't have to worry about any sense of income. There's never any reference to him having a job, for example, right? But he's got plenty of money. Um, he's able to live this decadent lifestyle. And even like those that are like somewhat close to him, granted, no one other than Lord Henry is really that close with him. Even Lord Henry doesn't really know Dorian's true nature at this point here. These friends that are with him at the dinner party here might have the same kind of attitude that Lord Henry expresses here. Okay, but Dorian again has a very pessimistic view here, saying that he would gladly change places with anyone. Okay, which is maybe somewhat doubtful. Um, he even says he would even change places with the dead man here, suggesting that he wants to die. And is that really the case? Does Dorian want to die? Well, I would argue that if he did want to die, that he could just commit suicide after all here, or even expose himself to James Vane if he thinks that's really, really happening. Of course, he's rationalized it isn't here. But he says it's not that he fears death itself, he fears the coming of it, which is somewhat contradictory here, I think, to some extent. If he's scared of the coming of death, then probably is scared of dying too, actually, right? Um, so he has this weird, very, very strongly pessimistic view here about life. It's questionable if he's being sincere. He's probably just like really still emotional at this point, still not quite sure what to make of seeing James Vane there after he tried to rationalize it being just like part of his imagination so much, actually. Okay. But I would ask you as readers to think about like, is he really sincere here? Like, you don't necessarily have to agree with my interpretation of things here. Either way, he definitely has a pessimistic view. Okay. Right after this, a letter from the Duchess is brought by one of her servants to Dorian, and presumably this is very flirtatious in nature, or even going further than that, possibly here, because of Lord Henry's comments revealed this to us. He says, quote, how fond women are of doing dangerous things, end quote, page 156, and that, quote, the Duchess loves you very much. Okay, so these things definitely suggest to us that the Duchess is trying to pursue an affair with Dorian here. It's just not clear how explicit she is in the letter, actually, here. Lord Henry doesn't even see the letter, but Dorian doesn't deny any of these comments either, actually. Dorian only says that Henry is talking of scandal, and that there's never any basis for scandal. That's a paraphrasing of what he says, which is very ironic of him to say, right? Because Dorian has been involved in so many scandals in the past. Actually, there's so many rumors floating around about him and all these people he's been involved with whose lives are ruined after their time with him, which makes us wonder, so like, why would he make a comment like that there's never any basis for scandal? He's been involved in tons of scandals, right? Does this really show that he's changed his view about things? It's another question for us to consider here. Okay, so other things for us to consider with this is that, by him basically refusing the Duchess here, like he tells Lord Henry that he's not going to pursue any kind of like relationship with her, even though she quote unquote loves him, as Lord Henry says, seems to support that Dorian actually does regret his decadent lifestyle, right? Because he's saying now, I'm not going to have an affair with her. There's never any basis for scandal, actually. There's never any basis for affairs. And if we want to be more specific, narrow it down like that. So that seems to suggest that he does regret his decadent lifestyle, and that he is maybe trying to atone for that, or at least move on from it. I don't know about atoning necessarily, but at least does seem to reflect a change in attitude on his part. Okay? Dorian says here also, quote, "I wish I could love with a deep, I can't read my writing here. I think it was deep sense or something of pathos in his voice, but I seem to have lost the passion and forgotten the desire. I am too much concentrated on myself. My own personality has become a burden to me. I want to escape, to go away, to forget." That last part about forgetting reminds us of him going to the opium den. There was other specific references to him wanting to forget about murdering Basil specifically, and maybe other things too for that matter here. But this seems to be like the most introspective that Dorian has been, possibly in the whole book actually here, right? Again, very, very much pessimistic view on things, saying like he can't even feel love. He doesn't even know like what that feels like anymore, actually. And he seems to think that he's a bad person. He says he's too concentrated on himself, suggesting he realizes that he's a selfish person, actually, right? And his own personality has become a burden to him. That strongly suggests that living a decadent lifestyle has become burdensome to him, actually, right? That he's gone too far with it, actually, and he just needs to like get away from that. He says he wants to escape here, actually. Okay. But we can still ask, like, is this really authentic of him? Why would he be saying these things? I mean, again, don't have to necessarily accept my interpretation, but I think it's a sign that he does want to change his lifestyle here, because of the negative consequences of what's been happening now. We see him again having this feeling of being haunted by the terrible things that he's done. And James Vane certainly represents this too, whether he's real or imaginary. Dorian feels haunted by his past deeds here. Okay, which suggests us too to go back to decadence, another topic for us to consider with the research paper. Is that a decadent lifestyle eventually leads to someone feeling remorseful about that, actually, right? Because that's what we see in Dorian right now, actually, right? And of course, we don't know of anyone who comes anywhere near the kind of decadent lifestyle that Dorian lives. Yes, Lord Henry and the Duchess and these other people at the party do live decadent lifestyles, but there's no evidence that they come anywhere close to as decadent as Dorian himself is, actually, right? Okay, let's go back to Lord Henry a little bit here. Lord Henry opines that there's nothing to gain from analyzing the death of the man in the bushes, actually. He says, quote, "It has no psychological value," end quote, from page 157. But he, quote, "should like to know someone who had committed a real murder," end quote. So this is a very interesting line. It's very ironic, of course, because he knows Dorian, and Dorian is a murderer, actually, right? But of course, Lord Henry is not aware of this, actually, right? And doesn't have any chance to pursue this. But it also represents a very decadent attitude of Lord Henry, right? Here he doesn't even want to like dwell on the death of this man, even though, of course, it's like somewhat tragic. He doesn't even want to think about it because he doesn't get anything out of it, actually, right? He only wants to like analyze something like this if there is psychological value, as he says, right? And remember that when he tries to influence Dorian early on in the book to become a more decadent person, what was his reason for that? He viewed Dorian as a psychological experiment. He wanted to see the effects of having that kind of attitude, of taking decadence to the extreme, ultimately, here, right? So we're reminded of that, about just how decadent Lord Henry is ultimately here. And it's also we get a sense that he's trying to avoid ennui. He's trying to avoid like boredom here too, because to him it would be boring to sit here feeling sorry for this man that died here. It serves no purpose to him ultimately, right? So all he wants is just to get something out of this here, and he can't get anything out of it. So he says, like, well, let's move on. Let's avoid the boredom of sitting around thinking about this, actually. Okay. Then we get Dorian leaves them, and the Duchess and Lord Henry are brought together here for a little bit. And we get a lot of like the similar kind of repartee between them that came up in recent chapters too. One one of the significant parts that I would focus in on is that Lord Henry asks her about her husband, the Duke. Has he never been jealous? And she responds with, quote, I wish he had been, which suggests that the Duchess wants to make her husband jealous, of course, right? Probably through her flirting with Dorian and possibly other men too. And maybe even specifically trying to get him to become jealous by cheating on him, right? If the flirting doesn't work, then we might expect her to go a step further. Certainly, she seems to be willing to go that step further with Dorian here, as is suggested through Lord Henry and the narration of the chapter here, and the way that Dorian is specifically rejecting her too, actually, right? So, anyways, and again, this would represent also a somewhat decadent attitude, right? She doesn't seem to care about being faithful to her husband. She openly flirts with Dorian multiple times. And she's just trying to feel something and get her husband to feel something too in this case, right? In this case, the jealousy. There doesn't seem to really be a lot of strong love between the two of them actually here, right? So maybe it's an attempt just to get him to feel something, if anything. It's also we get a sense of her trying to avoid ennui too, like we just talked about with Lord Henry. That to her life with her husband seems boring as it is, right? If she can at least make him jealous, at least that's something new, something different, actually, right? Between the two of them to change things. And again, she might be pursuing Dorian out of just a sense of ennui too, that she's just bored with her life as the way it is now. Okay, and wants something kind of new and exciting, which Dorian represents to everybody practically. Okay, and meanwhile, Dorian lays terrified in his room. The man's death and Harry's comment about wanting to know a murderer are very upsetting to Dorian. Even though he knows Lord Henry doesn't know about his murder of Basil, he's still just so upset by this. Again, showing even though he tried to rationalize how everything's okay earlier, and he's just imagining James Vane, it shows us that he hasn't really moved on actually, right? That he's still distraught and still can't just is still upset by things, right? Still thinks that there are bad things coming for him ultimately. Okay. And then Dorian goes on to inquire about the dead man. He goes to the gamekeeper asking, who was he? Does his family need any money? Because I could send them money, suggesting that he feels somewhat guilty about it, or maybe it's an attempt just to atone for his other past deeds that are unassociated with this actually here. But the gamekeeper doesn't know who he was and only says that he looked like a sailor, which immediately sets Dorian off because he's reminded of James Vane, who we are reminded of earlier in the chapter in the narration, that he was a sailor too, actually, right? So this prompts Dorian to run off with a, quote, terrible hope, end quote, which of course is probably a hope that this guy is James Vane, because if James Vane is dead, then Dorian doesn't have to be worried anymore so much, right? Or at least maybe he's rationalizing that way to himself. His conscience still might be haunting him, of course, right? So he runs off to go see the dead body, which is in another location. And when he does see it, he does confirm, yes, it is indeed James Vane, actually. And then we have his, quote, his eyes were full of tears, for he knew he was safe, end quote, on page 159. That's the very last sentence of the chapter. And so he's so happy now because he knows that he doesn't have to be worried about James Vane hunting him down anymore, right? Okay, but is he really, quote unquote, safe, actually? That's still very questionable. We still get a sense that his conscience is probably still going to be haunting him here. And it makes us wonder also, what is his attitude going to be like in the next chapter now? Is he just going to go back to being completely decadent now that he doesn't have to worry about someone like James Vane coming back to haunt him with his sins? Or is his conscience really getting to him at this point still anyways? That's yet to be seen, but that's a question for us to consider here. Okay. So just to go back to the research paper topics of, pessimism, ennui, decadence, and degeneration. Degeneration, I think we see the least of in this chapter. There's just really not a lot of evidence in this chapter to back that one up, so I probably wouldn't focus on that chapter for this. Maybe go back to the opium den chapter for an example of that sort of thing, or Dorian participating in terrible behavior previously. Okay. But as I said earlier, we definitely get a sense of pessimism in this chapter coming from Dorian in particular, as I talked about earlier, with his like sense of a bad omen, him thinking that nothing can really get better for him and such. That he'd be better off dead, or even wishes to be dead, if we think that's authentic. We even get that a little bit from Lord Henry too. Like another quote from him that I didn't mention earlier was that he feels that everyone is destined for quote unquote disillusion on page 157, which is a very pessimistic view about life, right? That everyone ultimately is just going to become disillusioned with life and realize that the way they thought about it was all wrong and such, right? That's definitely a very pessimistic view on his point, from his point of view at least. Okay. I said earlier we also have a sense of ennui coming especially from Lord Henry, who seems to be always trying to avoid that. He doesn't want to dwell on the death of the man in the bushes because it has no value to him and it would probably be boring. Of course, Dorian has felt this way in the past when we look back at like the chapter that listed off all the various activities and things that he'd been collecting over a long period of years. Actually, we got a sense back then that he's trying to avoid a sense of ennui. And as I said earlier, the Duchess, her flirting is a sign of trying to avoid ennui, and trying to create jealousy in her husband is trying to avoid this feeling too. Okay? And then to go back to decadence, of course, Dorian in this chapter seems to be disillusioned by this, right? There's nothing that he does or says in this chapter that represents a sense of decadence on his part, actually, right? Of course, the whole hunting party itself is somewhat decadent because what's the point? They're going hunting for rabbits, if nothing else here, and for what purpose even? It doesn't really serve any purpose other than just for the thrill of hunting here. There's no reference to them actually eating what they will hunt, so there's no like utilitarian value like that here. It says we can view it as a decadent act in itself. Okay, of course the party in itself is all like a kind of decadent in a way with like the lifestyle, and I talked about that in the previous chapter a little bit. Okay, and also the Duchess's flirting behavior here is somewhat decadent too, right? She's not really worried about the consequences at all. It's just, she just wants to experience something new with Dorian and with her husband too, and trying to instill some jealousy in him as well. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in thinking about some of these topics involving the Fin de Siecle that I talked about for the research paper, and in general with analyzing this chapter as well.